I'd like to call to order the April 17th regular meeting of the Planning Commission.
Bobby, can you hear?
You ready? Would you like to lead us in the pledge, please?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Chair Kistner?
Yes, here.
Vice Chair Hardy?
Here.
Commissioner Knudsen?
Present.
Manette?
Here.
And Pond?
Here.
Next item is public forum. This is an opportunity for the public to address the Commission on items of interest to the public that are not listed on the agenda. Because of restrictions imposed by the Brown Act, the Commission may not engage in any discussion or take any action on matters not described on this agenda. Please observe the time limit of 3 minutes. Is there any public comment? Public comment is closed. 4.1, these are consent items. 4.1 is approval of the minutes from April the 3rd. The Commission meetings from April the 3rd, 2 of those written. Design Review Exemption to build a 570 square foot carport at 1222 Alexander Court in the medium density residential zoning district.
I'll move approval of the consent items.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Vice Chair Hardy?
Yes.
Commissioner Pond?
Yes.
Knudsen?
No, I was hoping to have a brief discussion on 4.2, but if everyone else votes yes, then that's fine.
Did you want to pull it?
I did want to pull it.
Okay.
Wait.
I'll amend my motion to exclude 4.2 and move approval of 4.1.
I'll support that. Second.
Roll call, please.
Vice Chair Hardy?
Yes.
Commissioner Pond?
Yes.
Knudsen?
Yes.
Chair Kistner?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Commissioner Monet?
Is that out of sight, out of mind?
Could be, Lester.
Can you turn on the microphone and bend the phone over it?
That's what I'm doing.
It's still awfully weak.
Could I have on 4.2, could it simply be a staff report to verbally discuss this piece, please?
Sure. Yeah. So our intern Joseph Brokoff was the planner on the project. However, he had some personal business to attend to tonight. I'm happy to present his item. The project is essentially the construction of a new 570 square foot carport at 1222 Alexander Court, which is zoned medium density. It's currently a quarter-acre lot developed with a single-family home and one accessory dwelling unit with an attached garage. And the project is proposing to construct a 570 square foot carport attached to the existing ADU in a location that's currently used as uncovered parking. It's accessed via a access easement, which is identified on page 15 of 69 in your packet. And then there's more details identifying that the carport meets the 3-foot setback requirements on page 17 of 69 in your packet. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and the applicant, Polly Ogden, is here as well.
My only question, Planning Director Hausch, is it's in the staff's purview that this is exempted from Planning Commission oversight. Is that correct?
Well, it's a new carport, so what the zoning code states is that minor projects identified as not having the potential to create significant impacts, and I'm ad-libbing what the code says, shall be placed at the Planning Commissioner's discretion, shall be placed on the Commission's agenda for determination of an exemption.
Great, so I don't have any questions. Thanks.
Perfect.
Do I hear a motion to approve 4.2? Or Lester, do you have any questions on it?
I do not.
John?
Move 4.2 is drafted by staff.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Pont,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hardy,
Yes.
Commissioner Knutson,
Yes.
Monette,
Yes.
Chair Kistner.
Yes. Next item is 5.1, St. Helena 2040 General Plan Environmental Impact Report Scoping Meeting.
Thank you, Chair Kistner and members of the Commission. Our consultants, Dayton Bhatia, are here, or representatives from our consultant firm, Dayton Bhatia, are here to present this item, and I will let them get up as soon as the PowerPoint gets going.
What did I do with
But essentially, this is just a scoping session to allow the public to comment on the scope of the general plan EIR. It's a mandate of CEQA that prior to the initiation of an EIR or as a part of the initiation, lead agencies hold a 30-day scoping period to allow comments on what should be included in the scope of that environmental analysis from the public, and it is very typical for jurisdictions to hold a meeting by which the members of the public can verbally provide their input and comments as a part of that 30-day process. Comment cards are available in the back. However, I think the attendance of this meeting is probably showing us some of the community interest in the city being able to move this project forward and get it towards adoption. But with that, I'm waiting for the...
Number 1.
Oh, hold on. PowerPoint should be coming up, and I will let Andrew Hill present the item.
Would help with this.
And in the meantime, I will just say traffic counts have begun. So for 2 different projects, so folks are seeing some of the traffic counters being installed around the city. We've received some comments and questions about that. So it is worth noting that there are multiple traffic studies being done within the city currently. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Noah. Good evening, planning commissioners and members of the community. The city is preparing an environmental impact report to look at the potential impacts of implementing the general plan update and to identify mitigation measures to reduce or avoid those impacts. Pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, tonight's scoping meeting is being held to hear from members of the public about the range of environmental issues to consider in the EIR. And so the focus of tonight's discussion is really on environmental impacts and not on the content of the general plan itself. I have a very quick presentation to set the stage for any public comments. I'm going to give a high-level project description. I'm going to go over the environmental review process, talk about some of the requirements of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and then look at a roadmap for the EIR. Very briefly, for any members of the community watching who may not be up to speed, the current St. Helena General Plan was adopted in 1993. In 2007, the city began a process to update the general plan, which culminated in a draft of the general plan and EIR being released in 2010. The focus of the current effort is really to revise the 2010 draft in order to incorporate feedback from the Planning Commission and City Council subsequently, and to address new state guidelines, and to look at and to incorporate information on 3 adjacent unincorporated study areas. The current effort at updating the general plan will require an EIR, as mentioned before. The planning area includes all of the city limit, the sphere of influence, as well as 3 additional study areas that are adjacent to but outside of the current city limit. These are all areas which the city provides a certain level of municipal service to at the moment. Looking at them on the map. Here we are. The first of the 3 study areas is shown there in red. It's the location of the spray fields associated with the city's wastewater treatment plant. The second area is shown in yellow along Highway 29. It includes some residential and commercial properties where the city provides utility services currently. And the third area is adjacent to the city limit up to the northeast. It's a location of some city-owned utility infrastructure, including water tanks, and the city provides water service in that area. The purpose of studying these 3 additional areas in the general plan and documenting information in the EIR is exactly that, to document information regarding any sensitive environmental resources or any regulatory or capacity constraints in these areas where the city provides municipal services. Oops, a little fast. Oops. Here we go. The draft general plan will include all of these 11 elements. The housing element, which was adopted by the city in 2015, is not included in the general plan update, and so it won't be the subject of the EIR. Oops.
If you want me to manually do it for you, I will.
I think I got it. Thank you, though. So the key components of the general plan, as I mentioned, really builds on the 2010 draft, but the key components would include a new mixed-use land use designation designed to encourage a mix of uses on infill sites in central St. Helena to provide housing opportunities close to where services and retail are. It also includes capital improvements to expand the bicycle network to improve access to key destinations in the city. And it includes updating the general plan policy framework to ensure that there's consistency with state guidelines. This is a quick snapshot of the environmental review process, including opportunities for public comment. Right now, we're in the very early stages of the process. On April 2nd, the city released a notice of preparation, which announces to public agencies and members of the community the intention to prepare an environmental impact report. And that release of the NOP kicked off a 30-day scoping period. We're in the middle of that now. It runs through May 1st, and people have the opportunity to provide input on the scope and content of the EIR either at tonight's meeting or subsequently in writing to NOAA by May 1st. Following the close of the comment period, all the input received will be taken on board and considered in the environmental review, which includes technical modeling and development of any mitigation measures to address any impacts. All of that information will then be rolled up into a draft general plan, which is published for public comment. That stays on the street for a period of 45 days, during which members of the community or public agencies can submit comments in writing. Following the close of that 45-day period, the city will then respond to all comments on environmental issues and produce a final EIR, and that comes in front of the Planning Commission and then ultimately in front of City Council in public hearings for certification of the EIR. So that, in a nutshell, is the process. We're still very much in the early days, and there are numerous opportunities for the public to provide input on the EIR. Oops. Here we go. One of the requirements of CEQA is that all of these 18 resource categories be analyzed in the EIR. It covers everything from aesthetics and visual resources to biological resources to traffic impacts, utilities impacts on public services like schools, really a full range of environmental issues. What we know, however, understanding local conditions here in St. Helena, is that some of these issues will require a deeper dive and a closer look. So, for example, agriculture, given the context of Napa, the priority that communities in Napa place on agricultural preservation, also the existence of prime farmland in the area, that we'll really need to give a careful consideration to impacts to agriculture. Similarly, traffic, Highway 29 is a real pinch point and a cause of concern in the community, so looking at the potential impacts of the general plan on traffic will be another item that requires careful consideration. But of course, during the scoping period, we're looking for comments from the community about other resource areas that require careful consideration. At the same time, CEQA allows for issues where it can be clearly demonstrated that there will be no impact, no significant impact. CEQA allows for those items to be scoped out. And so, for example, in the case of St. Helena, if we think of mineral resources, we know that there are no active mines in the city right now, no known deposits of mineral resources that could be affected by implementation of the general plan. So what we can do is document the reasons in the EIR, but we wouldn't have to do an entire chapter and a detailed analysis on it. And so it's a way of streamlining the process. And so provisionally we are thinking that mineral resources is one of those categories that would be scoped out. But of course, again, during the scoping period, we're looking for public input to confirm that that's the case, or to let us know if there may be others that don't require the deep dive. Again, though, all of these 18 resource categories will be addressed at some level in the EIR. In a moment, we'll open it up for public comment or comment from commissioners as well on the scope and content of the EIR. And to give everyone context for the type of comments that we're looking at, we're really looking at answering these two questions. Are there any specific concerns related to these 18 resource categories that will need analysis in the EIR? Are there concerns related to potential impacts for transportation or biological resources? And if so, what actions would address those potential impacts? So, for example, there we go. For example, if we look at traffic and transportation, the type of comment that we're looking for is locally here in St. Helena, are there any hot spots where traffic congestion is a particular concern? We're looking to know, are there any locations where roadway safety is a particular issue that the EIR would need to consider? What about emergency access? Are there any concerns on that front? Or any concerns regarding pedestrian, bicycle, or transit access? This is the type of comment that we'd like to hear from the community or planning commissioners so that we can focus the EIR analysis accordingly. Similarly, looking at another topic, hydrology, drainage, and water quality, what we want to know is, are there any water quality concerns in waterways in St. Helena, for example? Are there any risks to groundwater supply that we should be aware of? Are there any particular areas of the community that are susceptible to flooding? Or are there any concerns regarding drainage patterns or runoff? Now, of course, we have access to a variety of databases, and we'll be relying on maps produced by other government agencies. But what we're looking for is particular local knowledge from members of the community who may be aware of things that we should know of and that should be considered in the EIR. So that's sort of to give you a flavor of the type of comment that we're looking for tonight. And then, sorry. Yes, other CEQA requirements. As I mentioned, the document will be looking at significant environmental effects, and it will include mitigation measures to reduce or avoid them, growth-inducing impacts, cumulative impacts, and of course alternatives. All of this information will provide city decision makers with data points to evaluate the general plan update. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, the scoping period, the 30-day scoping period runs through May 1st. And anyone who is not available to make an oral comment tonight can certainly submit a comment in writing to NOAA by that date. And we do anticipate the publication of the draft DIR later in the fall of this year. So that concludes my presentation, and I will open it up for public comment.
Any of the commissioners have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple. Noah, you mentioned that there are traffic counts going on around town. I imagine for most of the roadways, traffic counts are more than sufficient here to identify how well they're operating. 29, however, is an exception to that rule. If you've watched how it operates at peak, there's significant queuing at the intersections. So significant that if you just look at the intersection, you get a level of service of B or C, when really it's the ahead of the intersection that's causing a lot of blockage. So you're not operating at B or C or even D. 29 at peak is F, my best professional estimate. So what are you guys going to do to take a look at that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think level of service by calculation, actually, the technical methodology is an average of all four approaches, and it doesn't consider that one might be more heavily impacted than the other. So
Well, it's so heavily impacted, it's actually diminishing the amount of traffic that can get through the intersection. So if you just count throughs and turns that are passing through the intersection, you're getting a falsely high level of service. I'm a traffic planner professionally, so I don't think just intersection LOS is functional on 29 at the signalized intersections at peak. And certainly traffic counts won't give you anything, because once again, you're not operating at the set level of speed. So what are you guys going to use in terms of analysis on those sections of 29 that are clearly operating at F?
Right. I think I'm going to have to ask Farron Piers is our traffic subconsultant, but I'm going to have to get with them to give you a distinct answer. But I think that over and above intersection LOS, segment LOS might be a better metric to get at the type of issue that you're looking at.
I just want to make sure that happens.
Okay.
You're rerunning the traffic model?
Yes.
Okay. And you're doing the NVTA's traffic model, MTC's traffic model.
So the Napa Solano County model is the newest one, and so that's the one I believe that we'll be looking at.
Okay.
I know that Farron Piers is working to make sure that it's calibrated locally and doing some testing on it because it's a new model.
You're windowing it?
Farron Piers, yeah.
Farron Pierce is doing, okay.
Yep.
I may want to talk at some point to who's ever doing the traffic work at Farron Pierce. Okay. One more thing. I know the city started in 2007 officially to work on the general plan, but it actually started before that. There was a joint city Chamber of Commerce committee. I don't think you'll find much of it in the city records. That was actually about a year before that.
Yes.
So really it's 2006.
Okay.
That's right.
I'm super encouraged by this. I think this is fantastic, and some of the things that are definitely within our control, and some things are sort of beyond us, right? So the things that are beyond us are like Route 29. It'll be very curious. I don't know if this is really within the scope, but so much of that traffic has nothing to do with us. It's throughput from Calistoga, or points up north to points south up to Angwin. It's fascinating to me, but I'm very encouraged by some of the other aspects of the general plan, the open space, the public health and safety, circulation. Some of those things, I really hope that we're thinking about things holistically. This is a walkable town and a very bikeable town, and those aspects of the general plan update, I think, particularly compared to what was done back in '92, I think are super important. So I'd encourage you guys to put on the really broad hat that I know you can do for these sorts of things, and I really hope that our community participates. We're not seeing too much right now, but maybe they all wait for the end. I don't know. We'll see. All right, that's it.
Mr. Hardy? Wake up.
Well, I'm awake.
I know you are.
A few observations about traffic problem spots. Historically, I don't know that this would still be true, as I haven't seen a comprehensive traffic study in a long time. But historically, the Adams Street corridor, especially the intersections at Adams and Main and Adams and Railroad, were two of the most problematic. And in the mid-'90s, when Safeway's expansion was approved at its current location, to mitigate the traffic effects of that project, the project EIR required the addition of right turn lane at Main and Adams, basically widening and restriping the Main Adams intersection, which then was never done for reasons that are hard for me to remember with precision, but I think it had to do with location of Caltrans-owned infrastructure, signals, standards, and things of that sort. So I think, I would recommend, if possible, that the traffic consultants actually reference the Safeway EIR for some background on previous looks at the intersection. I walk as much as I can when I go from place to place in town, and as a pedestrian, I definitely find the Railroad and Adams intersection the scariest place that I regularly use to cross the street, especially at the PM peak. There's certainly other intersections of note, but looking at circulation more generally, I think some attention to the impact of traffic congestion on public safety is really important, especially now that within the city limits we have only one crossing over the Napa River to the Silverado Trail. And that bridge, the Pope Street Bridge, is for emergency service vehicles effectively impassable at the PM peak. I'm concerned about the delay that occurs when emergency service vehicles have to choose between going north to Deer Park and south to Zinfandel. I don't know that it belongs within the scope of a general plan EIR, but I'm reminded when I think about traffic circulation and public safety that our access as a community to the nearest hospital is severely impacted by Napa River flood events. Flooding you probably have in general. Certainly you've got access to all the mapping you need. One thing that I've lost track of over the years is the status of the city's storm drain outfall into Sulphur Creek. I think that's roughly at Oak Street, but I know historically one of the problems during main events is that the level in the creek rises up to and sometimes above the level of the outfall, which then backs water up the storm drain all the way up to Tainer Street, basically, where I live. So just understanding how the shortcomings in the city's drainage system affect the extent of flood events on the city streets. That would be a place to look. Another observation, again, I don't know how useful it will be. In the course of the joint project, I think the city, the county, PG&E, Caltrans were all involved in undergrounding a stretch of utilities on the southern approach to town, Highway 29, and because of the way that was related to the extension of the continuous left turn lane, the undergrounding was done at the same time, and the nature of the project was such that it involved the wine train right-of-way, which had the result at a certain point State Public Utilities Commission weighed in, and I think at one point they were threatening to require an additional 4 traffic signals on Highway 29. I'm not sure my memory is completely accurate in this regard, but I'm fairly certain that included both Whitehall Lane and Zinfandel, and may have included some other locations. So anything in the general plan that might affect the wine train, one should understand, has the potential to trigger a demand for signalization driven by the PUC's perceived interest in protecting the rail line and potentially making traffic conditions even worse for those of us who live and drive here. That's it for me.
Commissioner Monette?
Bobby.
Hello?
Go ahead, Bobby.
Yeah. Okay. I had some concerns related to the land use and growth management section. A couple of questions. Is this the correct time to ask them?
Sure.
Right ahead.
Okay. Okay. These concerns are related to CEQA topics that should be considered in the EIR analysis, to my way of thinking, and I'm wondering what actions, if any, can be taken to address these concerns. Under policies on page 233 and 2-34, LU 2.3, no, not that one, LU 2.6 is considering allowing higher density housing in single-family neighborhoods within medium and high-density residential land use designations as long as the development character of a single-family area, including lot width, orientation to street, building heights, on-site parking, traffic, noise, among other considerations. LU 2.8, develop and implement residential design guidelines and or form-based codes for single-family and multiple-family uses to provide oversight and guidance for new buildings and renovations. Guidelines should ensure that new residential development is consistent with the design, size, and footprint of older residences in the neighborhood. Consider the impact of new development on surrounding residents. One more, community design, topic area 3, implementing action, CD 3.F, page 724. Establish residential street guidelines that ensure a safe environment for families and children.
Bobby, we're not talking about the general plan tonight. We're talking about scoping session on the EIR. So if you want to talk about the EIR, that's fine, but you cannot discuss the general plan tonight.
State laws regarding ADU and multiple family by right development. How will the EIR mitigate the impacts of this state law in some way to support the GPU?
Bobby?
Excuse me,
we are not talking about the general plan tonight. We're talking about the EIR scoping. That's all we're talking about. The general plan has been thoroughly discussed.
Was, how will the EIR mitigate the impacts
of
this
that's
state
it.
law in some way to support the general plan policies and implementing actions? That is my question. It is about the EIR, and I'm wondering how will the EIR mitigate the impacts of the state law in some way to support the general plan. These implementing actions and policies of the general plan. That's my question. And I would really like to have the opportunity to ask my questions. Other people have an opportunity to say what they want to say. So, is there a way to respond to that question?
I'm happy to provide a response. This is Noah House, Planning Director.
Pardon?
Can you hear me, Commissioner Ronette?
I can hear you. It's not super easy. But yes, I can hear you.
So the EIR will analyze the potential impacts of full build-out under the general plan land use policy or element. So the land use graphic shows all the potential land use designations of the city, and the EIR will analyze the environmental impacts of full build-out of that of those designations, which will include some analysis related to ADUs being by right, and the potential impacts of increased density or additional residential and commercial development associated with the land use policies of the city. What we can't promise is that all impacts will be mitigated. So the EIR will study those impacts and attempt to mitigate them. However, some impacts will be found, or potentially could be found, to have significant and unavoidable impacts. And this is actually a common thing for general plans because you are looking at full build out of a city over a 30-year time period. So that's an important aspect for the public and the Planning Commission to understand, that not all environmental impacts of a 30-year plan are able to be mitigated to less than significant levels.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I have three concerns. They're very simple. I think somebody's already mentioned the emergency access to the hospital because of just the Pope Street Bridge being available. And I think that would be difficult even with the Pope Street Bridge if we don't have some other access to the trail from the east side of town. I would like a full analysis of the north side south traffic flow. I'm concerned about the going through and getting traffic off of 29. If that's fine, and I'm also very interested in an analysis of the safety issues involved with the flood project, which has been completed. So I think we need to really look into the flood project and what the Corps of Engineers and FEMA says about the levee. Mm-hmm. And those are my comments, at least right now. Thank you.
Unfortunately,
else?
I just thought of a couple things more. How do you intend to handle the wine train?
Well, so I guess the wine train could generate impacts under a range of categories. So, it would be analyzed under noise, for example.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of transportation. Right now, it's essentially not a transportation service. It's a tourist service, but we're talking a 30-year time span. Could become a transportation service at some point.
Right.
There's been studies done on that.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to handle it as just a tourist service or a transportation service? Are you going to assume there are stops?
I have a response.
I mean,
Okay.
It's part of the scope,
So Senior Planner Heacock has some direct knowledge of the wine train being specifically identified in the CEQA guidelines by the state. I don't know if you want to add to it.
Yeah, there's the wine train is specifically called out in the CEQA guidelines that if passenger service is ever required, a separate EIR will be required for that passenger service, and the PUC will be the lead agency for that action.
Somebody's already mentioned safety access. It's not only safety access to the hospital, but safety access for emergency services in town. We have sections of town that are not reachable except by the state highway. In fact, the fire department has already responded to that in some way by putting a satellite station out in one of those locations. I'm curious about how you're going to handle that as part of the document.
Yeah, I think we'd be looking at, so under the hazards section actually is where this falls. Emergency access is one of the questions under the category of hazards. And so we'd be looking at existing policies and plans, both in the cities and the counties, regarding emergency access, and evaluating, in consideration of the proposed build-out of the general plan, whether existing policies and practices are sufficient. And if they're found to be not sufficient, then the EIR would suggest mitigation measures to address those impacts, which could ultimately be folded into the general plan as policies or implementing actions. So that would be the process for identifying any potential impacts and mitigating them with actions that could become part of the general plan.
Anything else? All right, I'm going to open public comment. Is there any public comment?
Good evening. My name's Anthony McKelly. I wasn't going to talk about this, but listening to all you, I thought I might throw in my 2 cents. A couple of you mentioned the safety issue of getting to the hospital, and everybody tells me it's impossible. But why don't you go back to the flood control project and try to put that bridge back in across Adams to the trail with a good intersection. Pratt Avenue is a disaster. There's been enough people killed there. The Pope Street Bridge, you can't get big trucks across. You can make a great entrance. It could be out of the flood zone, at least to the trail. And then Safeway and all the trucks that come in could use that. They don't have to come up 29. You educate them to use the trail and to come in our back entrance. It relieves a lot of traffic problems for a lot of things, but I know there was a covenant signed and all that, but you should think about it. If it's a safety issue, maybe that can take some preference. But the only reason I wanted to ask tonight, does anybody know what all the cameras are going up around town for? Is that part of this traffic thing? I know friends have told me all these cameras going up at different intersections. I'm just curious. I just got back to today and was told about. I'm just curious what's going on in town.
Well, they've been looking for you, Anthony.
Yeah.
Any more public comment? All right, we'll close public comment. I would assume that we have...
We are assuming that those cameras are actually part of the traffic counts, but I cannot confirm. I will look for it. Senior Planner Heacock again today had noticed that they're labeled with traffic, a traffic company's name on the cameras, and so we are assuming that.
So we got more than one traffic study going on anyway.
There are several going on in town, yes.
Be nice to tell us, that's all.
You got it? Welcome home, Anthony. We missed you a lot. I would assume, do you have anything else that you would like to
I
try
do
and
not,
get
but-
from us?
No, but thank you for these comments. These are very helpful. It's exactly the kind of thing we were looking for, so appreciate
Thank you all for coming.
And so I would just remind the public that the scoping comment period goes until May 1st, and comments are directed to me as the planning director. My contact information is available on the website. We will take them in any format. They can use the comment cards, which are available as an attachment to this item. They can provide emails. They can provide handwritten comments, and I can even take a phone comment if someone wants to call me and just identify their concerns, although I always encourage people to write them so that way I'm not paraphrasing their direct input.
Director Hausch, how many to date?
None on the general plan EIR.
Maybe if the Fourth Estate can publicize, it's up to the Fourth Estate, publicize the fact that there have been no public comments on the scoping session.
I would say it is typical that these things come in sort of at the last minute, on the last day, in the last week. So, but it doesn't hurt to put another push out for sure.
They're going to wait till I see the draft
I know.
before they yell.
But
yeah.
That has nothing to do with the work habits of attorneys. I just want to put that on the record.
This is a great opportunity for us as planning and other representatives, appointed representatives of the town, to encourage citizen input early in the process rather than at the end of the process. And part of our challenge has always been suddenly stuff is presented and people go, I didn't know that this was, coming, and I'm really mad. Well, guess what? this is a great chance for us as a community to, get the word out, I hope.
So we look forward to comments, and we'll provide a summary of them after the close of the scoping period, at which time the general plan consultant will really be able to begin to run with the process and get the document, the EIR analysis and document started.
Thank you very much.
Chair Kushner, unfortunately, I have to take a break to attend to a personal matter, kind of an unexpected thing. I shouldn't be more than 10 minutes, but I've got to run.
Let's take a 10-minute break then.
Can we reconvene the meeting? Grace, are we going to?
Sounds good.
The next item is 6.1, which is a consideration of amendments to the city zoning code, St. Helena Municipal Code, Title 17, potentially revising Section 1748 Central Business District and 1752 Service Commercial to modify the list of permitted and conditional uses as deemed appropriate by the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Chair
Aaron.
Kistner. So this item was originally presented to the Planning Commission on March 20th, 2018, where due to the volume of potential changes, staff asked the Commission to review the provided information and be prepared to provide direction at a later date. That later date is today. Staff has identified several issues and concerns in regards to uses that are permitted by right versus those that require a use permit in the central business and service commercial zoning districts. As an example, clothing stores currently require a use permit approval in the central business district. As a very low impact use, staff feels that clothing stores should be a permitted use and not subject to the use permit approval process. In addition, the code is both overly specific and repetitive. Numerous retail uses are individually listed when they could easily be combined under one general retail category. Similarly, office uses are listed time and time again when they could be easily classified under a broader office use category. For these reasons, it is recommended by the Planning Community Improvement Department that the Planning Commission review the attached list of permitted and conditional uses along with the suggested changes provided by staff and provide direction to staff regarding which, if any, they would like made. I don't know if you wanted to add anything about the survey that's going on or...
Yeah, so the Commission is aware, I'm sure, that the Council has signed a contract with Cosmont and Associates, who are a group of real estate analysts who are providing a downtown market study. Staff anticipates that the direction provided by the Commission tonight will allow us to begin to make some changes to the zoning code, and we would bring the directed changes back from the Commission in addition to the results of the Cosmont study back to the Commission for overall consideration as a package. And that, I'll remind you, is just a recommendation to the City Council. So while these processes are going on in parallel, staff feels it's important for the Commission to still consider these items and provide direction. And the direction could be as simple as modernizing and cleaning up some of the redundancy and kind of, as Aaron mentioned, just in some places there's too much detail and in others there's too little. A lot of the land use definitions or descriptions do not have definitions associated with them. Commissioner Pont pointed out some instances where vehicle services and automotive services are separately identified under two different descriptions, basically just consistency issues. So a lot of the work that the Commission could direct would be just to undertake those types of things. However, staff does feel that there are some elements, such as the clothing store use permit, that are unwarranted and present just kind of bureaucratic and procedural challenges to new businesses being able to open and operate. And so that is one area where we would recommend a policy change. But generally, we're looking for overall broad direction from the Commission, and we'll take that direction, go back, make some zoning code modifications, present those to the Commission in addition to the results of the Cosmont study for an overall consideration at a later date, likely to be in June.
Any questions?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Great. Just a couple of, as you sort of work to make these simpler and more, more broad in a way.
Inclusive, I think.
Yeah, inclusive is, I think, the right term. There seems to be in some of this, maybe it's sort of a broad, there's some elements that are still sort of like overly specific, so I'd encourage you guys to just, go as strong as you can to make these sort of broad usages, just like you've thought about for general office use, which includes things like travel agencies and this, that, and the other thing. And, for example, like you've broken out massage from fitness. Maybe it's all just fitness, right? Or, some of these things, just the simpler we can do for our citizens and those that want to do business in our town, I think the better. Thank you.
John?
I was just wondering, it was really hard for me to understand you, Noah. I think it was you, Noah, who was speaking. But did you say that we're not going to be voting on this list tonight, or that we're considering other conditions as well, or what?
Tonight, staff is requesting general input on the overall direction of the potential policy changes, and staff will be taking that input, making changes to the zoning code, and bringing it back for consideration likely in June.
I see. I was wondering, where do you think these kinds of considerations might fit in? Should permits run with the land or the business? Clarification on what constitutes abandonment and the ease of changing uses when a business vacates a property? Should most uses be permitted? What standards should be used to determine this? What uses should be conditional? What standards should be applied to those that are deemed conditional? You know, when we decide to have most uses permitted until certain conditions trigger a switch to a condition, a designation such as a saturation number or distance from other existing like businesses, etc. Those kinds of considerations, is that up for, when will those, do you think we should be looking at those at this point rather than specific list of downtown, honing a specific list of downtown permitted and conditional uses? I'm just wondering what your feelings of that, what your ideas and thoughts about that are at this point. I mean, do you think we should be looking at those things in addition? Not at all? Or just honing down on this list for the permitted and conditional uses on right now?
Staff welcomes broader policy level comments. However, some of the points you raised, such as permits running with the land and what defines abandonment, are superseded by our jurisdiction. Those have been determined by state law and case law, so that's not a question that we can have any influence over. Making decisions based on what's a permitted use versus a conditional use, that is something we're asking the commission to do, and it's important. Conditional uses are typically those that have the potential for impacts, and therefore jurisdictions seek to have the ability to review them, potentially condition them to minimize or avoid those impacts. And one example I would use is a furniture store. Often has large deliveries. They have those large deliveries happening on a regular basis. They need to have a shipping and receiving area. That may be a use that, while might fit well downtown, might also need to be a conditional use downtown to ensure that all the potential impacts associated with that operation can be addressed through conditions of approval. Where the recommendation to remove the clothing store from a list of conditional uses and make it permitted is based on the relatively light footprint a retail clothing store has on a business district. Their hours of operation are typically standard. Their traffic levels are standard. Their deliveries and such aren't handled in a way that typically has a need for conditions of approval being placed on them to minimize or mitigate their operations. And then your last question regarding kind of tolling when enough of is enough, or do we have an oversaturation of certain types of use? The best way to regulate that would be to maintain them as conditional uses and amend the list of findings required to approve a use permit to include that. However, that is a policy level decision that may not be within the scope of this work based on past CEQA. However, if the commission's interested in us looking at that, we're happy to do so. We just may have to wait until the general plan's done before we can implement findings changes to use permits.
So you think it's worth the time and the effort to do what we're doing tonight without finding what the evaluators are going to tell us? They supposedly have analyzed hundreds of cities that are like ours, and I'm not sure what they're going to be thinking. But you think it's? I talked to you about this before, but I'm just wanting to ask again. You're thinking it seems prudent to go ahead and vote on these kinds of changes tonight without having looked at their analysis.
Staff absolutely does. So the commission and council have prioritized this discussion for over a year. They're doing a market study, so they're going to be looking at potential impacts to what's driving the number of vacancies downtown. What the commission can do is kind of identify types of uses that the community may find as beneficial and look at the process for those, as well as the current process and how it might affect the downtown operation of businesses in general. So I think they will dovetail nicely together, but they are distinct and separate questions.
Okay.
Oh, and I just thank you. And I would remind you, there is no vote tonight. This is direction that staff will take to then make draft changes that the commission can review and then recommend onto the city council. And again, that will be further informed by the results of the Cosmont study.
Okay, thanks.
A few things. Generally speaking, I'm going to agree with David that anything we can do to make this clearer to the applicants is great. I think that will help both in terms of somebody coming in and wanting to do something and who's ever marketing these places to market them.
That's right.
These empty downtown spaces that everybody's worried about. I also think that this is the kind of section that could move pretty much whole scale into the new zoning code. I mean, our central business district isn't going to change much. The rules in the general plan aren't going to change much. So I think whatever we do now is going to save us sometime in the future. So we're here, we might as well take a look at what we've got. I certainly like the idea of the office being grouped, and if folks are worried about what happens downtown on Main Street, offices have to be above the first floor. That's how that's written. It's not changing, but it's going to make it easier for the office instead of saying this kind of office and that kind of office and the other kind of office. They're all offices. I did express earlier to the planning director some concern about definitions. A lot of these words used in here don't have definitions in our code. I know that's a subject for follow-on later. That will definitely become part of the new zoning code. But as it is, there's a little danger in not having a defined word. The sooner we can do that, the better. There's also some uses in here that I think we may want to consider moving from to conditional. And let me just point out one of those that I'm kind of curious about that's permitted in the CBD. Watch and clock shop. Provided businesses includes on-site services and repair. My worry about that is, in many ways, watches have become a fashion accessory, have become jewelry. At the higher end, they are indeed jewelry. And I think those should be treated as if it was jewelry. So we would put it under conditional uses rather than permitted. It's just those uses like that I would like to have staff take another look at to make sure that they break only one direction. We had a jewelry store downtown that was a lot of watches, a lot of high-end watches. If they'd taken out the rest of the stuff, which I don't think was that large a part of their business, frankly, they would have been not conditional. So it's those little ones I would like the staff to take another look at, if they would, please. Another concern is the 200 square feet minimum. You have to have at least 200 square feet to be considered under any of these rules. And one of the listings in here is automatic teller. That's just an example. There might be others. Basically, I've never seen an auto teller of 200 square feet unless it's connected to a bank. I've seen ones that are just, standing out in the middle of the street or stuck in somebody's wall. So we should do something to consider uses that are less than 200 square feet. How are we going to accommodate them? That one just stands out as something that's readily apparent reading through it. So in general, I'm in favor of it. Clean up the nomenclature. All autos should be under auto rather than motor and auto. You mentioned that. There's a few others sprinkled in there that the same use is listed some other terms. Like one of them says accountant office, bookkeeping office, and then further down bookkeeping office is listed again. So generally, I'm in favor of doing this and doing it now because it'll save us time in the future.
Well, I'll start with some observations. It seems to me that
You can sit on the floor.
Bites back too, Lester.
the overall structure that we have, both with respect to the way in which permitted uses have been identified and conditional uses, and also the distinction between central business district and service commercial. Both those things, it seems to me, really, more than anything else, including concerns about environmental impacts, reflect primary general plan policy concerns. The service commercial central business district distinction was a direct response to a period 40-some years ago when there were big empty spaces on Main Street, and there was a perceived need to make some policy changes to protect the viability of the central business district. And in order to do so, there was a fundamental distinction made between pedestrian-oriented uses, which is what belonged in the central business district, and what were considered automobile-oriented uses, or to put it differently, the kinds of uses to which one would need or really want to drive, as opposed to walking down Main Street to shop in the retail stores. So that was a general plan level distinction that then directly influenced the lists of uses in each of those districts, because one was intended to be all about pedestrian oriented and the other about automobile oriented. That's comes out of the 70s. I don't know if that's in the 76 general plan or if it first appears in the 86 general plan. I've forgotten. The 93 general plan, then we had a further shift, another layer of policy concern about not simply protecting the overall viability of Main Street, but rather, in addition to that, preserving local serving uses. So at that time, then, following on the revisions to the general plan, the lists of permitted and conditional uses were revisited, and all those uses that were either already lost or potentially threatened local service uses automatically went on the permitted use list. And you could think of it as an endangered retail species list, and really have a sense of what was driving that selection. I'm expecting, though we're a long ways from the end of the general plan update process, that the distinction between local serving and visitor serving will disappear from the general plan, and thus no longer have any business animating these categories in the zoning ordinance. But it seems to me that the distinction between pedestrian-oriented and automobile-oriented remains sensible and appropriate. I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't think these lists are just about what does or doesn't have some potential for impacts of concern. The overall approach to streamlining I'm all in favor of that. Well, even things that we were just discussing, like watchmaker, watch repair. This is a vestige of the quest for retention of local serving uses. There are a lot of things on the list that strike me as unnecessary but harmless. I'm not sure that, just shoe repair. We could sort of say we're never going to get one, therefore delete it, but if we're never going to get one, then leaving it in there doesn't really do any harm either. Personally, I'm most concerned about how we identify and categorize and regulate the uses that we do have and are likely to see more applications for. That seems to me the greater priority. The others may be a kind of textual nuisance, but...
I have a question for you, though. For example, there are some businesses on Main Street that have auto access from railroad or from the alley by the railroad, or that have access from Money Way.
A lot.
A lot of them. Or, in fact, is the Central Business District, does it include the shopping area that that's on Main Street? Where Sunshine and where Wells Fargo is. Those are easily auto accessible because of the large parking available there. So I know certainly a lot of the things in the industrial districts south of town sort of have different elements to them, right? You need to have a truck to pick up lumber. But I'm just sort of curious as to your differentiation between the businesses on Main Street that actually do have quite a bit of auto availability.
Well, I think that's a great example of how contradictions get built into all of these scenarios. I'm quite certain that the distinction between pedestrian-oriented with obviously the heart of the Main Street shopping district, I'll call it, clearly in mind, which for the most part runs from Adams down, say, to Pope and Spring. That strongly influenced how everything was structured. But for reasons I don't recall or perhaps never knew, the dividing line was the bridge over Sulphur Creek, conceptually. And so if we view the Central District zoning ordinance decisions through the lens of pedestrian versus automobile, then the shopping center where Safeway is located, which used to have a lumber yard, doesn't make a whole lot of sense as part of the central business district. Neither does the Wells Fargo Sunshine Complex. I don't know that there's any compelling reason to consider redesignating those service commercial, but I think with the important exception of the space over there by Sunshine that for 30 years or so was Ben Franklin Variety Store, the big concerns about vacancies in the central business district 40 years ago and today have to do with what's going on in that main pedestrian corridor. So I think that's, and you know, we talk about it as pedestrian oriented, I think in large part, maybe not entirely, but in significant part because those businesses will die if the only people who go there are the ones who manage to find a space on Main Street to park. There's not enough parking on Main Street. So it's in some ways just the geography, if you will, of the district means people are going to have to park somewhere and walk to the stores in a way that isn't quite the same over at Sunshine or Safeway. But we could also, we could reinvigorate the tourist-oriented local serving concept by recognizing that Main Street corridor is where visitors want to go, and if we want to think about areas where we can have local serving uses, we probably need to look to the places that we'd be more likely to drive to. So these are just, I think, policy-oriented ways of organizing the categories that are still useful to think about.
Yeah, I think it's viable to have the central business district and service commercial division, simply because most of our visitors do use the central business district, and many of them don't use the service commercial areas.
Most of the visitors say they need to go to GOTS. So
yeah, a lot of them do, but I'd rather not start the whole local serving versus non-local serving divisive dichotomy again, if we can possibly avoid that one.
Well, that's not in the general plan anymore either.
I know, but the words were said. I'd rather have the tape be blank for 18 and a half minutes. Never mind. I do think it's a viable division, regardless of the historical antecedents thereof, and I'd like to keep them for two reasons. One, it does clearly delineate an area where the city has spent special attention and a lot of time and a lot of effort. The whole historical downtown, which isn't exactly the central business district zone, but does include most of it, is, I think, a viable area of concern for the city in and of itself. The service commercial areas are indeed, generally speaking, more automobile-oriented. And I think that's a viable split. I'd love to keep it. I can understand there'd be reasons not to keep it, but I would love to keep it at this point, regardless of where it came from and how it came to be. It is.
Here's a related comment that I think.
I think I'll be. Go ahead.
You're breaking up.
Bobby, you're breaking up.
It's that Canadian phone connection to our. It can be very hard. I have a related thing that I think is maybe really germane for staff and actually for some of the thinking that's now going into, like, how do we support our central business district and our commercial area. Notice how Yountville has done a spectacular job of sort of extending their central business district up towards where R&D Kitchen is and towards Kelly's, and there's a bunch of new restaurants up there, and really, while there's some winery focus, there's also a new coffee shop, a new breakfast area, and that's sort of an extension of an existing business district where there's no parking up there. But it's a very, they've done a great job of sort of allowing uses to sort of extend the central business district area. And what have they done specifically in that sort of section of North Main Street, Yountville, right up by the park and the cemetery? What have they done in that area to sort of allow uses that, on behalf, that was there was a bar up there and there was nothing much else going on. What have they done to really encourage businesses up there? It's very impressive. And once again, there's not that much parking up there. There's some tertiary parking, just like there is in our central business district. There must be some ways that we can, as a city, encourage that sort of infill in areas that were underutilized. And I'd like to, I'd like us to think about that.
I think that's what they've hired the outside people to come in and do, the cosmetic people.
Yeah, sure.
And my comment tonight is I think that Aaron's done a really good job with this. I would leave what he's done thus far, and I would wait now until we get the cosmetic results. And we've got two of the city council people on that committee, and I think between that and the fact that we're into the general plan, I think pretty deeply now, and I think it's going to be finished by the end of this year. I really don't think we need to really do a whole lot more work on this at this point in time, and I think Aaron's done a really good job of what he's done. So that's my opinion.
I agree with Grace. I was going to say that it's premature to do the work right now, but I think all the things that were talked about tonight were important and interesting, and I agree with what Grace just said.
I think I pretty much agree, but I'd like to see him clean this up. That doesn't mean it has to.
I didn't mean for him not to clean it up. I think he intends
I don't think
to
it
clean
needs
up.
to come back to us immediately.
I don't either.
No,
I don't think you want it back until after they've done their analysis downtown, because you don't know what they're going to come up with.
And we could then see both at the same time.
Then you're going to start all over again, and that's.
I think it's premature until we get all the analysis back, and then we can make changes with more information.
Well, I'll back up. Actually, I enjoyed
I think the comments should all the comments tonight should go to the city council.
Really?
Should get on.
in my contrarian spirit.
That came with the JD.
I really don't think the consultant's market analysis is going to do much to inform the lists of permitted and conditional uses. I'll be very much surprised. It may influence our thinking some. It may influence the council's thinking more than it influences us. That wouldn't surprise me.
I think that's true.
But I don't think the economic forces that drive what does or doesn't work on Main Street and who is or isn't interested in leasing a particular space are influenced by anything on the zoning ordinance other than, for those uses that require one, the cost and delay of a conditional use permit. That's the one area where I see potentially some interplay, and it seems to me that what staff is proposing is really going a significant way in the direction of minimizing those costs, which is why I certainly see little potential for conflict.
You got enough?
I would take this as general agreement, yeah.
Yes.
I think we're in
Yeah.
general agreement.
So what staff has heard is that the commission generally supports the efforts made to date to clarify the regulations, provided a little bit additional direction to look to simplify how they are applied and reviewed. And the commission generally supports the overall efforts to streamline some of the application of the code. Staff, and then also to create definitions for all the existing uses. So staff will work on those changes while the market study is underway, and will then come back to present those items after working with and hearing from the Cosmot folks and the council subcommittee on the topic, so they kind of see the direction, the results of the direction provided to the commission with the subcommittee, and then that will come back to the commission with further discussion, requesting additional direction and input at that time.
I just don't think we should expend a whole lot of time on working some of this stuff until we get the results of what they're working on. I mean, that's in their 5 goals, if I believe.
Understood.
If I remember correctly. So.
And just so you know, I have had conversations with the consultants, so they are inquiring with staff on some of our current
That's
challenges.
fine.
And I told them about this meeting. I believe they're watching tonight,
Okay.
so they will be looking to
And
some of your.
That's the way I feel we should be working, Noah. Well, in agreement? You guys got enough? Yep. All right. Do we have any departmental reports?
Public hearing now before you make a decision.
Oh, go ahead. No, we're not voting tonight. This isn't a vote.
it may open the public hearing, correct?
Go ahead.
My name's Anthony McKelly. I live 1125 Cornell, and the reason I'm speaking about this is because our family owns 2 buildings in town. We've had them probably for the last 40, 50 years. My dad had a bar business in town for over 35 years, and that was over 30 years ago. You have to make it even more simpler than what you're doing. The reason the buildings are all empty in town, I mean, a little side thing, rents in town run from $3.50 to over $10 a square foot. How can people afford that? Then pay the planning director or your planning department $6,300 for can we open that business? We've had over, every time, because we're on the bottom end of the rent list because we get a lot of applicants. That's the biggest concern. It's so much red tape to get through the city where it takes 3 to 4 months. Then they have to go to the building plans, and then the landlord's out all that time, plus the tenant is out. You have to make it simpler. What you need to do is just have what you don't want in the business district. Hotels, dispensaries, chain stores, restaurants, and offices off Main Street or upstairs. The rest, let the free market do it. Because like Letzer said, 30, 40 years ago, you tried to control it. What do you got downtown? You have no local serving businesses. The only 2 down there is the auto parts store at Brown's Auto and Steve's Hardware. The rest of the trinket antique stores, the jewelry stores, they don't do anything for the public. Let the free market do it. It's already screwed up. The previous council screwed it all up. You need to let it just go where it's going to go and just put the things you don't want. And let those people come before you, but let everybody else. For instance, 10 years ago, Peggy O'Kelly opened St. Helena, and I hope your 3 minutes doesn't buzz me off. But anyway, 10 years ago, Peggy O'Kelly opened up St. Helena Olive Oil Company in our business with a wine and olive oil tasting permit. Then Jamie came along after 6 or 8 years, I think she was there, for 2 years, kept the same permit, opened the olive oil company again. The Saint came along, though, wanted to do olive oil, but a little more wine tasting. Couldn't do that. They had to pay $6,300 to say, can we do what already was approved later? And I know it's going to tell you probably they were going to have more seating and more things, which I understand, but you got to just, people don't want to do business here. We had the guy from Allen's Frame 4 years ago come to our place when it was vacant after Peggy, and he had 2 consultants, one in Washington, one in the Midwest. They told him, get out of St. Helena. It's unprosperous to do business anymore. He went to Calistoga. Remember Allen's Frame? They used to be on Main Street. They're gone now. It's too difficult here and you can't blame some landlord because they had to pay exorbitant amounts of money for their buildings, and they want it from the tenants. The tenants can't pay $10 a square foot. It doesn't pencil out, even at being at $3. It's hard for tenants. And in one building we have 5 tenants. The other one, I think there's just the one on Main Street. But we keep the rents low, but not everybody can do that. We inherited it. We got it for nothing. So we can carry on with my dad. When he had Main Street, the first time he rented, it was 75 cents a square foot for where the St. is today between the Model Bakery and the market. 75 cents. And that was about 30 years ago. And we've raised a little bit across the street at $6 and $10. That's what's the city, the money the city spent, that $25,000 is going to come back to tell them rents are too high and red tape is hilarious. And people don't want to do business here. If you want those, and let the free market, the businesses go. Just put what you don't want. And let everything else just come through. Let the building department and the health department deal with it. If it's a parking issue or what, let them do it. Don't waste all your time. I mean, you want to micromanage everything, and you can't just keep doing it. I mean, look at the mess we got downtown. Thank you.
All right. Close public comment. Are there any departmental reports?
Yeah, so the Planning Department amended the agenda after publishing a little bit early, so this went out on, I believe, either Thursday afternoon or Friday morning. But the last item in the agenda today is a report on the housing element. So the state mandated housing elements be updated in 1980, and so this is an annual progress report that the staff provides to the Planning Commission and City Council on efforts to remove governmental constraints, to maintain, improve, constraints to the maintenance, improvement, and development of housing within the city. And that's the stated goal of the housing element. The progress report, which is attached to this report, details some of the actions that have been taken over the last year towards implementing the housing element. Staff will just briefly identify some of the things we've done. So, as you're all aware, we received the home grant totaling $500,000 to assist with rehabilitation and repair of low-income units. That process to make those zero-interest, zero-payment loans is underway, and we have just started receiving some applications, so that's moving forward. In addition, the City Council has prioritized some money towards specific affordable housing projects, Turley Flats and our town, St. Helena, as identified in, or money that came out of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And then those projects were also supported through finding certain fees weren't applicable to them and some other efforts prioritized by the council. It's important to identify that this progress is substantial. However, there are a number of directed actions in the housing element that are remaining to be implemented, or limited efforts in their implementation have been made. There's specific policy direction to modify or consider modifying the city's inclusionary housing ordinance to adjust and expand the distribution of incomes. So trying to maybe make some folks who are above the moderate income level be able to qualify for inclusionary housing. There are also identifications to change the zoning code to change the density requirements, incorporate mixed-use housing, and target sites for increased development potential throughout the city. There's a policy that directs the city to provide assistance for low-interest loans for 10 first-time home buyers. And then there's also some policy direction to expand the amount of senior housing units through mandated requirements. So this could be done through inclusionary housing or other zoning efforts to prioritize senior housing. Those are some of the things that have been identified in the adopted housing element. So this is existing policy that we haven't had the ability or resources to make much traction on. it's important to identify that these actions will naturally fit within the City Council's prioritized goal of a comprehensive housing strategy, which they have just initiated. However, there are some other goals that are expected to be more challenging, such as establishing a full-time shared housing coordinator, pursuing mortgage revenue bonds and credit certificates, and planning for road and utility improvements to facilitate the development of our housing opportunity sites. So these are kind of big ticket items that are the city is likely to have challenges in the near term implementing over this housing element cycle, which goes through 2020. The white paper that the council commissioned to kind of kick off the identified housing strategy is expected to be presented in late June. So staff wanted to let you all know that that is underway, but the timing is not imminent for its approval, submission. The links to the housing element and the housing needs assessment were provided in the report. Staff would encourage the commission and public to review those. There are a large number of policies that I did not reference that are also prioritized in this document. There's some other housing-related interests or items of interest that staff wanted to talk about. As most folks are aware, the governor signed a package of 15 bills designed to increase the supply of housing throughout the state and specifically focused on affordable housing. They make a number of changes. I'm not going to go into them. The report identifies some of the kind of higher profile bills, and then there is a link to a summary of them provided by the League of Cities. So staff would encourage you to review those and the public. One is worth noting, though, that the reporting requirements for housing element reports were strengthened and have since become mandated. If we do not provide those reports to the state, then we have the potential of losing our grant funding. So that $1 million sidewalk grant that was granted to the city could be lost if we don't stay up on our reporting. So obviously staff really prioritized getting this done ahead of the April 1st deadline. But just so you know, from 2010 through last year, none of these reports were ever done. There was no mechanism or staff resources dedicated in the city. Since we've been trying to catch up on some of that past work that wasn't done, this is one of the things that we did last year. We did 2010 through 2016's last year, submitted them all, and then this year we just did 2017, so just be aware of that. Also, the Calderon settlement. This is a very important policy affecting document. We are on track to meet all of the mandates associated with timelines through 2018. So by the end of this year, we were supposed to have approved and or granted occupancy to a certain number of units. Staff does believe we will meet that mandate that goes the 2018 December 31st milestone date. However, we are concerned over the ability to meet the 2020 milestone date, which mandates that we have 25 affordable housing units either approved or occupied by December 31st of 2020. Right now, we are in a deficit of 9 units. So these are low-income units. While our town, St. Helena, has some grant funding, we do not have a site identified. We do not have any pending applications for these units. So this is a concern to staff. If the city fails to meet that milestone, we have agreed to pay $750,000 from the general fund into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So it's either approve the units or pay the money. So it's just, this is an important thing for city decision makers and leaders to be aware of, and staff is pursuing all options for that development. However, we have no applications pending for those 9 units, just to be aware. Finally, the units that have been approved, the Turley Flats and the Brinkle Court, to date, the city has loaned $700,000 in Affordable Housing Trust Fund monies to Turley Flats, has purchased a parcel on McCorkle and donated it to our town, St. Helena, and then given them an additional $460,000 to build their 8 units. So we are committed to these projects and we are supporting them with financial resources, but it just shows it is very costly to do affordable housing development of small projects because you don't get the economies of scale as much, so it requires a lot of subsidy. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund is refilled by market rate development projects paying their impact fees. So just so as you guys are approving these projects here, there is some benefit that goes in that trust fund. even though some folks may debate about the cost and benefit of those trade-offs. Finally, just to let everyone know that the trust fund balance, separate from those commitments I mentioned, is $400,000. That's how much we have above and beyond those commitments to those other two projects. So that's how much is in the bank that is spendable. With that, staff's happy to answer any questions if you have, but there's a lot of information in the packet and the report on that, and I would encourage the Planning Commission and the public to review it.
I found one of the things interesting in there was that, if I'm reading it correctly, I believe there's an option to get matching funds for your housing trust fund.
Through one of the bills?
Yeah, I believe it's in. I believe it's in there. If you want to look, if you want me to tell you where it's at,
That would be great.
I'll come back. I think that it was that. I also found it interesting that you can't just name vacant lots as prospective, because we've done that for years, and I thought that was very interesting when I read. It's a very interesting report.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. I didn't think I was going to, but I did. So.
I know there's a lot of
And
information
I found
there.
found a couple things that I thought were really worthwhile to have read.
I'm glad.
So.
And looking forward to the next housing element cycle, a lot of these regulations will really affect us as we look at our next housing element. So we have this adopted one. The RENA numbers were relatively low for this cycle. I think Housing and Community Development is identifying more realistic numbers. They used to kind of shoot high and hope that cities would try to get there, but there were no mandates behind them. Now I think they're putting more realistic numbers, but it is likely that we will start to see penalties to cities who don't meet those numbers. So just be aware of that, and it'll really come into effect after 2022.
Thanks for this. Sorry.
Go ahead, Tim.
John. Thanks for this. No, I think it's really interesting. The one thing I will sort of state, sort of from St. Helena's perspective, I think this town appreciates smaller bore developments, and so they are more expensive. And so subsidizing, they're very difficult to do. Maybe impossible is the wrong term, but very difficult to do. But I think the indirect subsidy of those sorts of developments from other developments is worth the trade-off that our town has made, if we can get those actually made, where we're not trying to concentrate very large or even moderately sized subsidized housing. I think having them sprinkled and smaller is, to all of our, including people that will be living in them, I think it's to all of our benefit. So.
I find the statute changes particularly interesting, being that it looks like several of them could apply to projects that are in the pipeline for St. Helena. There's a case in San Francisco I'm aware of right now where the project proponent has gone forward and set aside 22% of the units as low or very low, and they're going under the new statutory allowance that calls approval to be ministerial. I would think that would be something that we might have some concern over, particularly since low and very low here aren't low and very low for most of the population of the state of California. The numbers here are startlingly high where low and very low start, which may actually mean it could pencil out for some of those projects in the pipeline. So I think this new set of laws should be of concern to everyone in town, because we may find ourselves having to do things that we wouldn't do otherwise.
I agree.
Well, I have to say, I think that's the whole point of the legislation. The perception being at the legislature, and I think certainly in some parts of the state it's entirely accurate, that absent this kind of arm twisting, there are important parts of California that simply won't do what the legislature believes needs and must be done to construct new housing to meet the needs of the entire community. And it's always complicated, as it is here, by the fragmented nature of local jurisdiction and the way in which we carve things up between cities and counties, and without any effective regional planning in this context, except for the process that generates the number. With respect to the potential for projects qualifying for ministerial uses, if SB 35 is the only one of these bills that does that, I note that there are two qualifying criteria that have to be met, and it's not, it's an either or. It's either if the city fails to submit an annual housing element report for 2 consecutive years prior to the date when a development application is submitted, or HCD determines that the city issued fewer building permits than the locality's share of the regional housing needs allocation in each of the 4 income categories for that reporting period, the first 4 years or last 4 years of the 8-year housing element cycle. So if you don't fit one of those 2 qualifying criteria, then the rest of this doesn't apply. If they did fit St. Helena, then we would be an urban cluster with a population of at least 2,500 and less than 50,000. I think we're more likely, although I don't want to assume that we're always going to be in sufficient compliance that that's not a viable threat, but the separate legislation that limits the discretion to deny a project, doesn't eliminate it, but limits it, is unquestionably applicable. And what the latest round of legislation has done is it has raised the bar for findings of denial even higher than it was previously. I'm not sure if it does more than that, but I know that it does at least that much. And that certainly will affect some projects that come through the city's process, and that will make the entire review and approval process different from anything we've ever done.
It certainly will, and potentially expose us more in terms of liability. Any ruling we might make, because all of a sudden it's a new game.
You betcha it is.
New standards. And I am worried about our RENA numbers. Historically, we haven't met them. I recognize historically that they were much, much higher than they are this cycle. Nonetheless, I have some fears we won't meet them again. So I think we could easily be exposed.
Got an agenda forecast, sir?
So the list of projects that have been applied are filed on the city's website under the planning project website or webpage. I think we were up to 30 in 2018, so we are very, very busy. Also, we had the building permit submitted for 1111 Main Street, so that will be moving forward with construction, which is exciting, as well as the building permit for the new Montessori school building that the commission approved. So the building department's busy, the planning department's busy, and so you will be seeing some construction projects go on out there, and then there are as the public and the commissioner know, some relatively large projects under review in the department as well. I would just refer folks to that website. Check the pages as plans are resubmitted. They will be uploaded, and so the most recent plans will be available on the website. And other than that, we're managing the 2 EIRs, the Hunter project and the general plan, and we're looking forward to the budget. May 9th is the budget hearing, and we have put in some resources for some additional code enforcement and some requests for some potential options on how to handle this kind of blip in our workload. But we'll discuss that with the council and the public at that hearing, and you all will be kept informed.
Thank you very much. Meeting's adjourned.